It was a sunny Tuesday morning in suburban America, the kind of day where the air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and passive-aggressive HOA notices. John sat at his kitchen table, sipping his coffee and scrolling through emails on his laptop. His inbox was a battlefield of HOA complaints. Your mailbox is 0.5 inches taller than regulation height. Your lawn is 3% browner than the community standard. And his personal favorite, your holiday lights were left up 2 days past the approved removal date. John often wondered if these people had a secret meeting where they brainstormed new ways to make his life miserable. But today was different. Today, the HOA had escalated their war against him to DEFCON 1. Just as he was about to delete another email titled, "Urgent. Your trash can placement violates HOA Code 4.2b, he heard a knock at the door. "John," Sarah called from the living room. "Someone's here for you." John sighed. He wasn't expecting anyone, but he assumed it was another HOA representative armed with a clipboard and an inflated sense of authority. He walked to the door, coffee mug in hand, ready to deliver his usual sarcastic rebuttal about how he'd rather spend his money on therapy than HOA fines. But what greeted him wasn't the usual clipboard-wielding busybody. It was 3 men in uniforms that looked suspiciously official, except for the fact that their badges were clearly homemade, laminated with what appeared to be packing tape. They stood there, puffed up like pigeons in winter coats, radiating an aura of self-importance that could only be described as wannabe mall cop. "Good morning," said the tallest one, who seemed to be their leader. His badge read, HOA Enforcement Officer, though John couldn't help but notice that enforcement was spelled incorrectly. "We're here about your wife." John blinked. "My wife?" "Yes," said badge guy number 1. "She violated multiple HOA regulations, and we're placing her under arrest." John stared at them for a moment, trying to process what he'd just heard. Arrest? For violating HOA rules? This sounded like something out of a poorly written sitcom. "Wait," John said, holding up his coffee mug like it was some kind of magical shield against stupidity. "You're telling me you're arresting my wife because she, what? Didn't trim the hedges exactly 3 feet tall?" Badge guy number 2 chimed in, clearly eager to prove his worth in this bizarre hierarchy of fake authority. "Actually, sir, her violations include unauthorized garden gnomes and failure to comply with mailbox aesthetic standards." John laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "Garden gnomes? You've got to be kidding me." But they weren't kidding. Badge guy number 3 pulled out what appeared to be a legal document, though it looked suspiciously like it had been printed on an inkjet printer running low on toner, and began reading aloud. Section 7.4c of the HOA bylaws prohibits decorative items deemed unsightly or disruptive to community harmony. Your wife's garden gnomes fall under this category. John looked over at Sarah, who had just walked into the room holding a plate of toast. She raised an eyebrow at the scene unfolding before her. "What's going on?" she asked. "These clowns say they're arresting you," John replied, gesturing toward the trio with his coffee mug. Sarah set down her toast and crossed her arms. "Arresting me? For what?" "For garden gnomes," John said, barely suppressing another laugh. Sarah turned her attention to badge guy number 1, who cleared his throat nervously under her gaze. She had that look, the one she used when interrogating suspects during undercover FBI operations, and it was enough to make even fake cops sweat. "Ma'am," badge guy number 1 stammered, "we're authorized by the HOA board to enforce community regulations." Sarah tilted her head slightly, as if she were examining a particularly pathetic specimen under a microscope. "Authorized by whom?" "The board," badge guy number 2 piped up. "And where's your warrant?" Sarah asked coolly. Badge guy number 3 fumbled with his papers before producing another document that looked like it had been hastily cobbled together in Microsoft Word. It had clip art of scales of justice in the corner and Comic Sans font for the header. "Here's our warrant," he said triumphantly. Sarah took one look at it and snorted. "This isn't a warrant. This is a joke." Badge guy number 1 puffed up again, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am, we'll have you know that failure to comply with HOA regulations can result in serious consequences." "Oh, really?" Sarah said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Like what? A strongly worded letter. John leaned against the doorframe, thoroughly enjoying this spectacle. He knew Sarah could handle herself. After all, she'd once taken down an international smuggling ring disguised as a charity organization. But watching her dismantle these fake cops was better than any Netflix show. Badge guy number 1 decided to play his trump card. Intimidation through bureaucracy. "If you don't cooperate," he said sternly, "we'll have no choice but to escalate this matter." Sarah stepped closer to him and lowered her voice just enough to make it chillingly calm. "You want escalation? Fine." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her FBI badge. A real one this time, and held it up for them to see. The trio froze like deer caught in headlights. "Oh," badge guy number 3 whispered. "Oh indeed," Sarah replied. "You've just attempted to arrest a federal agent on bogus charges using fake documents and impersonating law enforcement officers." John grinned so wide he thought his face might split in half. Badge guy number 1 tried to stammer out an excuse. We didn't know. That's obvious," Sarah interrupted sharply. Badge guy number 2 looked like he might faint. Badge guy number 3 dropped his fake warrant and muttered something about needing fresh air before bolting down the driveway. Sarah turned back to badge guy number 1 and badge guy number 2, who were now visibly shaking. "Here's what's going to happen," she said firmly. "You're going to leave this property immediately, and then you're going to explain yourselves to your so-called board. If I ever see you or your fake badges again." She let the sentence hang ominously in the air. The 2 men nodded furiously before scurrying off like frightened squirrels. John watched them go with immense satisfaction before turning back to Sarah. "Well," he said cheerfully, raising his coffee mug in salute, "that was better than cable news." Sarah picked up her toast again and shrugged nonchalantly. Just another day in suburbia. John had always suspected that the HOA was some kind of shadowy cabal, a secret society hellbent on making suburban life as joyless as possible. But after the morning's debacle with the fake HOA cops, he was starting to think they were less Illuminati and more Three Stooges. Still, something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. Sure, Sarah had scared them off with her FBI badge. But why would anyone go to such lengths to impersonate HOA enforcers? And why did they seem so desperate to arrest his wife over garden gnomes? John decided it was time to do some digging. He grabbed his laptop and settled into his favorite spot on the couch, the one with the perfect view of their backyard, where Sarah's infamous garden gnomes stood proudly among the tulips. There was one shaped like a pirate, another dressed as a wizard, and John's personal favorite, a gnome riding a flamingo. They were ridiculous, yes, but they brought a certain charm to their otherwise cookie-cutter suburban yard. And apparently they were enough to send fake cops into a frenzy. He started by Googling HOA impersonation scams, which led him down a rabbit hole of bizarre stories. There was one about a man who paid $500 in fines for having illegal Christmas inflatables, only to find out later that the HOA board didn't even exist. Another tale involved a woman who was forced to repaint her house because someone posing as an HOA inspector claimed her beige wasn't community-approved beige. It seemed like there was an entire underground industry dedicated to exploiting suburbanites' fear of HOA wrath. John leaned back and rubbed his temples. What kind of psychopath wakes up one day and decides, "You know what, I'm gonna scam people with fake HOA rules"? "Someone who knows how much people hate dealing with HOAs," Sarah said from the kitchen, where she was making herself a sandwich. She hadn't seemed particularly fazed by the morning's events. Then again, she'd once infiltrated a biker gang as part of an undercover operation. So fake cops were probably small potatoes in her world. "Do you think this is connected to your case?" John asked. Sarah shrugged. "Could be. I've been looking into some shady HOA practices lately, embezzlement, fraud, stuff like that. But I didn't think it would involve people dressing up like discount police officers." John frowned. "So what do we do now? Just wait for them to come back?" Sarah smirked. "Oh, they'll come back. People like that always do." Sure enough, she was right. The next day, John was out in the front yard pruning the hedges, because apparently, if he didn't keep them exactly 2.5 feet tall, he'd be fined. When he spotted a familiar car parked down the street, It was an old sedan with peeling paint and tinted windows that screamed, "I'm trying too hard to look inconspicuous." Inside were two of the fake cops from yesterday, badge guy number 1 and badge guy number 2, watching his house like it was the Pentagon. John pretended not to notice them and went back to his hedges, but inside he was boiling with rage. Who did these people think they were? Did they really believe they could intimidate him and Sarah into submission? He wanted nothing more than to march over there and give them a piece of his mind, but Sarah had warned him not to blow their cover just yet. Instead, he decided to have some fun. He walked into the garage and grabbed one of Sarah's garden gnomes, the pirate one, and carried it out to the front yard. Then he placed it right in the middle of the lawn where it was impossible to miss. The reaction from the fake cops was immediate. One of them started frantically typing on his phone, while the other gestured wildly toward John's house, as if he'd just witnessed a felony in progress. John grinned and waved at them cheerfully before heading back inside. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked when she saw him walk in with a smug look on his face. "Just giving our friends something to talk about," John replied. Sarah peeked out the window and laughed when she saw the pirate gnome standing proudly on their lawn. "You're such a troublemaker." "Hey," John said defensively. "If they're going to pretend this is some kind of crime scene, I might as well give them something worth investigating." For the next few days, John continued his campaign of passive-aggressive defiance. He moved garden gnomes around like chess pieces in an elaborate game designed solely to annoy their stalkers. One day he lined them up along the driveway like soldiers preparing for battle. Another day he arranged them in a circle around their mailbox like they were performing some kind of ritual. The fake cops didn't know what to do. Every time John made another move, they reacted with increasing levels of panic, taking photos, making phone calls, and even attempting, unsuccessfully, to sneak onto his property at night. But John wasn't just messing with them for fun. He was also collecting evidence. Every time they showed up or tried something stupid, Sarah recorded it with hidden cameras she'd set up around the house. By the end of the week, they had enough footage to make an entire documentary titled, "How Not to Run a Scam." Finally, Sarah decided it was time to confront them. She waited until badge guy number 1 and badge guy number 2 were parked outside again, this time trying and failing to look inconspicuous by wearing sunglasses and baseball caps, and then walked straight up to their car. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked sweetly. They froze like deer caught in headlights. We're just checking on some HOA violations," badge guy number 1 stammered. Sarah smiled innocently. "Oh really? And which violations would those be?" Badge guy number 2 fumbled for words but couldn't come up with anything coherent. "That's what I thought," Sarah said coldly before pulling out her FBI badge again. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me exactly who sent you here and why, or I'm going to arrest both of you right now for impersonating law enforcement." The two men looked at each other helplessly before finally spilling everything. They weren't real HOA enforcers. They were hired by someone claiming to represent the HOA board, but it turned out that person wasn't even part of the actual board. It was all part of a scheme designed to extort money from residents by threatening bogus fines and penalties. Sarah listened carefully before nodding curtly. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said before turning back toward her house. John watched from inside as she walked in triumphantly, and couldn't help but laugh when he saw badge guy number 1 and badge guy number 2 speed off down the street like their lives depended on it. "Well?" he asked when Sarah walked through the door. "They're amateurs," she said dismissively. "But now we know who's really behind this." John grinned wickedly. "Time for some payback?" Sarah smirked. "Oh, you have no idea." The next morning, John woke up to the sound of Sarah typing furiously on her laptop at the kitchen table. She was surrounded by a fortress of coffee mugs, legal documents, and what appeared to be a whiteboard covered in scribbles, arrows, and a suspiciously detailed flowchart titled Operation HOA Takedown. "Morning," John said, rubbing his eyes. "What's all this?" "Evidence," Sarah replied without looking up. "And a plan." John poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned over her shoulder. "A plan for what?" "To take down the HOA scam once and for all," Sarah said, her voice as calm and focused as a general preparing for battle. "I've traced the fake HOA enforcers back to their boss, a guy named Carl Whitaker. He's been running this operation for years, targeting neighborhoods with real HOAs and using their reputation to extort money from residents. John raised an eyebrow. Carl Whitaker? That sounds like the name of someone who'd steal your lunch from the office fridge. Sarah smirked. He's worse than that. He's a con artist who preys on people's fear of authority. But he made one big mistake. What's that? John asked. He messed with my garden gnomes, Sarah said, her eyes narrowing. John couldn't help but laugh. So what's the plan? Sarah clicked on her laptop and pulled up a map of their neighborhood. We're going to lure him out into the open. I've already contacted some of my colleagues at the FBI. They're setting up a sting operation. All we need is bait. John took a sip of his coffee and thought for a moment. What kind of bait? Sarah grinned mischievously. Something he can't resist. An opportunity to scam us one last time. By noon, John and Sarah had transformed their front yard into what could only be described as an HOA enforcer's worst nightmare. The garden gnomes were out in full force. Pirates, wizards, flamingo riders, even a gnome dressed as Elvis Presley holding a tiny microphone. They'd also added string lights in colors that clashed horribly with the neighborhood's approved palette and set up an inflatable unicorn sprinkler on the lawn. To top it all off, John had printed out a fake sign that read, "Welcome to Gnome Fest 2025, a celebration of non-compliant lawn decor." It was glorious. Are you sure this will work? John asked as he hammered the sign into the ground. Oh, it'll work, Sarah said confidently. Carl won't be able to resist something this blatant. Sure enough, it didn't take long for their trap to spring. Around 3 p.m., a black SUV pulled up in front of their house. Out stepped Carl Whitaker himself. A middle-aged man with slicked back hair, an ill-fitting suit, and the kind of smarmy grin that made you want to wash your hands just from looking at him. He was flanked by two of his goons, who looked like they'd been hired off Craigslist under the ad title "No Experience Necessary." Must look intimidating. Carl sauntered up to their front door and knocked loudly. John opened it with his best impression of an innocent suburban dad who had no idea he was about to be scammed. "Hello," Carl said, flashing what he probably thought was a charming smile but actually looked like he was trying not to sneeze. "I'm Carl Whitaker from the HOA Compliance Division. We've received multiple complaints about your property violating community standards." John feigned surprise. "Oh no, what kind of violations?" Carl gestured dramatically toward the yard. "Well, for starters, those garden gnomes are clearly against Regulation 7.4c. No unsightly or disruptive decorations. And that inflatable unicorn? Completely unacceptable under Section 5.3b. John nodded solemnly. "Wow, I had no idea. What do I need to do?" Carl leaned in conspiratorially. "Normally, this would result in some hefty fines, thousands of dollars, even, but I'm willing to work with you. If you pay me $500 right now, I can make all these complaints disappear." John pretended to think it over while Sarah watched from inside, recording everything with one of her hidden cameras. "Well," John said finally, pulling out his wallet, "I guess $500 is better than dealing with all that paperwork." But before he could hand over any money, Sarah burst out of the house holding her FBI badge. "Carl Whitaker," she announced loudly, "you're under arrest for fraud, impersonating an HOA official, and being an all-around terrible human being." Carl froze mid-smirk as two unmarked cars pulled up behind his SUV and several FBI agents got out. What is this?" Carl stammered as the agents surrounded him. "This," Sarah said coolly, "is what happens when you mess with federal agents and their garden gnomes." As the agents cuffed Carl and his goons, John couldn't resist adding his own commentary. "You know," he said cheerfully, "if you just left our gnomes alone, none of this would have happened." Carl glared at him but didn't say anything as he was loaded into one of the cars. Once they were gone, Sarah turned to John with a satisfied smile. "Well," she said, "that was fun." John laughed. "You know what? I think I'm starting to like HOAs, at least when they're fake ones we can take down together." Sarah rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her grin as they walked back inside. And outside on their lawn, The garden gnomes stood victorious, a colorful army that had helped bring justice to suburbia in the most ridiculous way possible. The fallout from Carl Whitaker's arrest was nothing short of spectacular. Within hours, the news had spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. By dinner time, the HOA Facebook group, a digital cesspool of passive-aggressive complaints and poorly disguised brags about lawn care, was ablaze with speculation. Posts ranged from, "Did you see the FBI at John and Sarah's house?" to, "I knew there was something fishy about those garden gnomes." John naturally couldn't resist adding fuel to the fire. He posted a picture of their most flamboyant gnome, the one riding a flamingo, along with the caption, "This little guy just helped take down a criminal empire. What did your lawn decor do today?" The post got over 200 likes and an equal number of comments, most of which were a mix of confusion, admiration, and one guy angrily ranting about how gnomes were an affront to community standards. But while the neighborhood was busy gossiping, Sarah was busy working. She'd spent the entire evening on the phone with her FBI colleagues, coordinating interviews with other victims of Carl's scam. Apparently, their neighborhood wasn't his only target. He'd been running his fake HOA racket in multiple communities across 3 states. The man was nothing if not ambitious. Meanwhile, John had taken it upon himself to celebrate their victory in his own way, by baking a cake shaped like a gnome. It wasn't particularly good, the proportions were all wrong, and the frosting looked more like it had been applied with a trowel than a spatula, but it was the thought that counted. "Ta-da!" he announced proudly as he set the cake on the kitchen table. Sarah looked up from her laptop and raised an eyebrow. "What is that?" "It's a victory gnome," John said, gesturing dramatically at his creation, "to commemorate our triumph over Carl and his merry band of idiots." Sarah snorted. "It looks like it's melting." "Art is subjective," John replied defensively before cutting them each a slice. As they ate their lopsided cake, Sarah filled John in on what she'd learned so far. Turns out Carl wasn't just scamming people with fake fines. He was also embezzling money from actual HOA accounts. He'd pose as a consultant, get hired by real HOAs to streamline their operations, and then siphon off funds into his personal accounts. John shook his head in disbelief. So not only was he running a fake HOA, but he was also ripping off real ones? That's like robbing a bank and then charging them an ATM fee. "Pretty much," Sarah said with a shrug. The guy's got no shame. Over the next few days, things only got crazier. The FBI investigation uncovered even more dirt on Carl, including evidence that he'd used some of his ill-gotten gains to fund an extravagant lifestyle. Apparently, he owned a yacht named the Compliance King and had spent thousands on custom suits embroidered with his initials, because nothing says trustworthy like monogram lapels. But while Carl's world was falling apart, John and Sarah were becoming local celebrities. Neighbors who had previously ignored them, or worse, complained about their gnomes, suddenly started dropping by to thank them for exposing the scam. "Honestly," said Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down as she handed them a plate of cookies, "I always thought there was something off about those HOA enforcers. They fined me $200 last year for having non-regulation bird feeders. Can you believe that?" John nodded sympathetically while trying not to laugh at the idea of regulation bird feeders. "Well, I'm glad we could help." Even Mr. Grayson, the grumpy retiree who'd once called their gnomes an eyesore, stopped by to express his grudging appreciation. "I still don't like those things," he said gruffly, pointing at the gnomes lined up along their driveway like tiny sentinels. "But I respect what you did." "Thanks," John replied uncertainly as Grayson shuffled away. But not everyone was thrilled about Carl's downfall. A small but vocal faction of residents began complaining that the whole ordeal had brought unwanted attention to their neighborhood. "This is exactly why we need stricter HOA enforcement," one woman declared during an impromptu community meeting held on someone's front lawn. "If we'd been more vigilant about following the rules, none of this would have happened." John couldn't help himself. "You're right," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "If only we'd banned garden gnomes sooner, we could have stopped Carl from stealing millions of dollars." The crowd erupted into laughter, except for the woman, who glared at him like he'd just insulted her grandmother. As satisfying as it was to see Carl brought to justice and to watch certain neighbors squirm, Sarah knew there was still work to be done. The FBI needed more evidence to ensure that Carl would face serious consequences. Not just for scamming their neighborhood, but for all the other communities he'd targeted. So she and John spent hours combing through old HOA emails, documents, and meeting minutes looking for anything suspicious. It wasn't exactly thrilling work, unless you find spreadsheets exciting. But it paid off when they discovered several discrepancies in financial records that pointed directly back to Carl. Armed with this new information, Sarah handed everything over to her colleagues. And within days, additional charges were filed against Carl and his accomplices. By the time it was all over, Carl had been hit with so many charges that even his overpriced lawyer couldn't spin it into anything less than a disaster. He pled guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, though not before trying and failing to blame everything on one of his goons. And the compliance king was seized by authorities. As for John and Sarah, they celebrated their victory the only way they knew how. By throwing a backyard barbecue complete with Gnome-themed decorations and a playlist that included songs like Don't Stop Believin', because sometimes you just need Journey. Neighbors came from all over, not just to enjoy free food but also to marvel at how two ordinary people had managed to take down an entire criminal operation armed with nothing but determination and garden gnomes. And as John stood there flipping burgers while Sarah chatted with guests about her undercover work, he couldn't help but feel proud. Not just of what they'd accomplished, but also of their ridiculous little army of lawn ornaments that started it all. "Here's to Gnome Fest," he said quietly as he raised his spatula in salute. It wasn't much, but it felt like justice. John had never imagined that his life would become the stuff of suburban legend. But here he was, standing in his front yard next to a sign that read, "Justice served, FBI and Garden Gnomes Unite." The barbecue had been a roaring success, and the neighborhood was still buzzing with the aftermath of Carl Whitaker's downfall. But now, as the dust settled, John and Sarah found themselves reflecting on what they'd learned from the whole ordeal, and how they could make sure it never happened again. The first order of business? Turning their lawn into an anti-HOA scam shrine. Sarah had insisted it was overkill, but John argued that if their gnomes could take down a criminal empire, they deserved to be immortalized. So he spent an entire weekend creating a display that included a plaque reading, "In Gnomes We Trust," and a photo collage documenting the sting operation. He even added a miniature replica of Carl's yacht, the Compliance King, which he'd made out of cardboard and duct tape. "It's tacky," Sarah said as she surveyed his handiwork. "It's glorious," John countered. But the shrine wasn't just for show, it had a purpose. John wanted to use it as a way to educate people about HOA scams and encourage them to stand up for themselves. He started hosting weekly gnome talks in their backyard, where residents could come to learn about their rights and share their own horror stories about dealing with overzealous HOAs. The turnout was surprisingly good, partly because people were genuinely interested, but mostly because John served free snacks. By the third week, he'd managed to recruit a small group of volunteers who were passionate about exposing HOA corruption. They called themselves the Gnome Guard, and their unofficial motto was, "We don't just protect lawns, we protect justice." Meanwhile, Sarah was busy wrapping up the FBI investigation. She'd spent countless hours interviewing victims, analyzing financial records, and testifying in court. It was exhausting work, but it paid off when Carl was sentenced to 10 years in prison for fraud, embezzlement, and impersonating law enforcement officers. When the verdict came in, John threw another barbecue, this time with gnome-shaped balloons and a cake that actually looked like a gnome. He'd hired a professional baker after his last attempt. The neighborhood showed up in full force, cheering as Sarah announced the news. "Justice has been served," she said proudly. "And let this be a reminder to anyone who thinks they can exploit our community. We will find you, and we will stop you." John couldn't resist adding his own commentary. "And if you mess with our gnomes," he said, raising his spatula like a sword, "you'll regret it." The crowd laughed and applauded, but John wasn't done yet. He'd been working on something special, a surprise for Sarah that he unveiled at the end of the barbecue. "It's not much," he said as he handed her a small box, "but I thought you deserved something to commemorate your victory." Sarah opened the box and found a custom-made garden gnome dressed as an FBI agent, complete with sunglasses and a tiny badge. "You're ridiculous," she said with a laugh. "You're welcome," John replied. As life slowly returned to normal, John and Sarah found themselves reflecting on how far they'd come since that fateful morning when the fake HOA cops showed up at their door. Their neighborhood had changed for the better, and people were more united than ever. The Gnome Guard continued to grow, hosting events like Know Your Rights Night and Scam Awareness workshops. They even managed to convince the Real HOA board to adopt new policies that prioritized transparency and accountability. But despite all the progress they'd made, John knew there would always be challenges ahead. Scammers would keep finding new ways to exploit people's fears, and HOAs would continue to push boundaries in their quest for control. That's why he and Sarah vowed to stay vigilant and to keep fighting for what was right. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, John turned to Sarah with a grin. "You know," he said, "I think we should write a book." "A book?" Sarah asked skeptically. "Yeah," John replied. "Something like Gnomes versus Scammers. How we took down an HOA fraud ring." Sarah laughed. "Catchy title." "I'm serious," John said. "People need to hear our story. It's inspiring." "It's ridiculous," Sarah countered. "Exactly," John said enthusiastically. "That's what makes it so great." Sarah shook her head but couldn't hide her smile. Maybe someday. For now, though, they were content to enjoy their hard-earned peace and their ever-growing army of garden gnomes. And as John looked out at their lawn, now filled with gnomes of every shape and size, he couldn't help but feel proud of what they'd accomplished. They'd stood up for themselves, fought back against injustice, and proved that even the most ordinary people could make a difference. Because in the end, it wasn't just about garden gnomes or HOA scams. It was about standing up for what you believe in and refusing to let anyone take advantage of you. So here's to justice and here's to gnomes. If you enjoyed this story, and let's be honest, you did, don't forget to like, share, comment below with your favorite part of our epic suburban saga, and subscribe for more tales of triumph. Until next time, keep your lawns colorful and your spirits high.